Well, we will be going live now to Sandton Convention Centre, where my colleague Rofhiwa Madzena is. Of course, the leaders of Brics have now agreed to admit new full members from January next year. Now, these are Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Iran, Argentina, Ethiopia and Egypt. Let's cross to Rofhiwa now at the Sandton Convention Centre. Rofhiwa, of course, historic moments, historic announcement by President Cyril Ramaphosa. We know that there are two African countries that are, of course, of key interest as well when it comes to those countries that have now officially joined the Brics grouping, Ethiopia being one of them and Egypt the other. Ethiopia, interesting, seeing that when it comes to, the GDP of countries, it is a bit smaller than even South Africa's, and South Africa is one of the smallest ones there. But it is the second largest country when it comes to population size in Africa. Egypt, of course, their strategic positioning also makes a lot of sense. The other countries, of course, being big role players in their own right as well, like you mentioned earlier, Saudi Arabia when it comes to oil, and the list goes on. But what's the latest you can tell us and your insights there in Sandton?
Yeah, very interesting developments. The Brics 5, Baron, has now become the Brics 11 from January next year. And important that you noted two African countries made it onto the list. But the notable things here when it comes to these economies is that both economies are growing at a rate of an average of 6% of an annual basis. Ethiopia has over 70% of its population employed, and Egypt has an unemployment rate of about 7%. So there are definitely lessons that South Africa can learn from these countries when it comes to issues that I've just highlighted there, economic growth as well as the unemployment crisis that we have here. But we do have Sthembiso Fakude from UJ who joins us this afternoon to discuss the breaking news this hour of the new entrance of the Brics grouping. A very good afternoon to you and thank you for joining us. Your initial thoughts on the countries that were chosen? Definitely some thought put into what these countries could potentially bring to the Brics stable when it comes to the development of the nations that are now part of the grouping.
Well, my initial thought was the name. What's going to be the new name? It's going to be Brics Plus or Brics with the abbreviations of these countries, but that's neither here nor there. It's an interesting development, of course, but concerns many of us have been the inclusion of countries such as Iran and Saudi Arabia, Egypt, that continue to suppress basic human rights. So the expansion, while it's going to be good economically, in terms of the optics on the promotion of basic rights, it's quite questionable, especially given what happened yesterday in Russia with the Ukrainian Recording.
And let's just, before we continue our conversation, let's just listen to that announcement for the benefit of our viewers of those countries being introduced into the trading bloc. Here's the President, and then we continue with our discussion in a moment.
As the 5 Brics countries, we have reached agreement on the guiding principles, standards, criteria, and procedures of the Brics expansion process, which has been in discussion for quite a while. We have consensus on the first phase of this expansion process, and other phases will follow. We have decided to invite the Argentine Republic, the Arab Republic of Egypt, the Federal Democratic Republic of Ethiopia, the Islamic Republic of Iran, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates to become full members of Brics. The membership will take effect from the 1st of January 2024.
Stemi, so you did highlight some of the issues or concerns that may prevail as we look at developing relationships between these countries. But some of the opportunities that may present themselves going forward, I mean, these are countries that were picked purely, one would assume, based on their strategic offering. Saudi Arabia with the oil, Egypt's strategic positioning geographically. What are your thoughts on that component of this decision?
Well, I think when it comes to Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates, it was deliberate because it's trying to balance the power competition that often exists between the two countries. And I'm not quite really happy with the majority of the Arab countries coming in. I would have preferred, although of course Egypt is still regarded as an African country, but we know where Egypt's interests lie. I would have prepared more of the sub-Saharan African countries that have applied or showed interest to be included. But having said that, it's great news that the Ethiopia is part of Brics. Ethiopia is the seat of African Union and is likely to push for a Pan-Africanist agenda within Brics. So overall, it's good news. We've got two Latin American countries, with Argentina coming in, the first Espanol or Spanish-speaking country to be part of Brics, and with the two other Arab countries coming in, or three other Arab countries coming in. So it's quite interesting. But these three Arab countries that have come in are also part of the Arab League. So one wonders to what an extent is that agenda going to be dominating Brics henceforth.
Yeah, I'm glad you bring up Ethiopia because I'd like us to focus a little bit on that country. It's worked really hard over the last few years to reduce the incidence of conflict, to get people employed, to get the private sector investing in its economy, and to just change the overall tide. And as a result, it has become one of Africa's biggest or fastest growing economy, and the trajectory seems to be positive. But because they are still young, in inverted commas, if you will, when it comes to full democracy and growth, what exactly do you think broadly would they bring to the table there?
Well, Ethiopia is the most important country within the Horn of Africa. It's got one of the strongest armies within the Horn of Africa. But I think the inclusion of Ethiopia is by and large because it's a seat of the African Union. And Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed has been quite well received by many platforms, not only the Brics, but also he gets quite well reception by the Western countries and the US. So it was deliberate for Ethiopia. And I think the relationship that Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed enjoys with Cyril Ramaphosa will see the African agenda being included and taking notice within Brics, and hopefully the Pan-Africanist agenda that Cyril Ramaphosa has since adopted will be pursued moving forward.
Stemi, so why would you reckon a country like Nigeria was not considered? Is the biggest economy in the country, followed by Egypt, albeit it being a frontier economy. One would assume that they would have had something significant when it comes to trade, investment and governance relations with these countries.
Yes, indeed. It's a big question why Nigeria wasn't included, because Nigeria is one of Africa's powerhouse economically and politically. So one would have expected that Nigeria would have been included. But we've seen Nigeria actually taking a step back in terms of or matters of Pan-Africanism. And we've seen some kind of, dwindling sort of relationship between ourselves, South Africa, and Nigeria. So we don't know whether that had an impact or influenced the decision by Brics not to include Nigeria. But it's a big question that I think as the day develops, we'll get reasons, particularly from Nigerians, why they were not particularly interested in this. But all the other countries that have shown no interest in Brics, over the weekend we had what Morocco said about not participating in Brics. So there is that, again, pushback. But Nigeria is also one of those countries that has been, to an extent, firm on positions of Russia. Russia continues to create problems. And one of the reasons why we have the current standoff in Niger, and Nigeria being the most dominant member of ECOWAS, could be the answer to the question you've just asked, to say that Nigeria is pushing back on Russia's involvement, because we know that the Wagner Group, which is supported by Russia, is involved in Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso, and all other countries at the moment, including Sudan. And ECOWAS has threatened over the past couple of weeks that they were going to be going in to forcibly remove the junta in Niger that is currently ruling, and that is currently holding Prime Minister Mohamed Bazoum in custody. So that could be an answer. There is certainly a disagreement and not seeing eye to eye between the Nigerians and the Russians, who are indirectly involved in Niger, where ECOWAS is intending military intervention.
Yeah, that's an interesting point that you bring up there. And I wonder if it raises any concerns from you in the meantime, before we engage other people, that perhaps Russia had a bit more weighting in the final choosing of the countries that ultimately were announced by President Cyril Ramaphosa. Do you think that may have been the situation, given what you've just described around Nigeria and the Niger situation and the like?
I mean, certainly. Mohammed bin Salman of Saudi Arabia and Mohammed bin Zayed of United Arab Emirates are very close to Russia, but there could be some kind of, convincing to do away from my thesis that Nigeria was excluded simply because of ECOWAS's intention to go into Niger. Niger is openly or the junta in Niger is openly working with the Russians and the Wagner Group. So that could have had an influence, and it could be answering the question why Nigeria was not involved, and at the same time also answering the question of the over-involvement in the decision-making processes of Brics by Vladimir Putin and Russia.
And then finally, this may seem like a silly question, but a genuine interest from myself actually about relations between Egypt and other African countries in general have never been really great, if you will, for lack of a better term. How do you anticipate Egypt engaging with the African member states going forward? Because I suppose these are relations that are going to need to be strengthened.
Egypt has never shown interest in the African Union. Egypt has always been interested in promoting and pushing the agenda of the Arab League. Arab League has been headquartered in Cairo, Egypt, for a very long time. So we'll have to see now what's going to happen. But I don't think it's great news. I know we like to always bring in Egypt as an African country, but Egypt does not want to be recognized as an African country. It's an Arab country, hence the Arab Republic of Egypt. So it's not an African country. It happened to be geographically trapped in Africa, but they do not identify themselves as Africa. Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, the president of Egypt, has not visited South Africa for various reasons, of course, but he hasn't been here. Hosni Mubarak before him refused to come to South Africa. So the relationship between us and Egyptians, that is South African and Egyptian, has never been healthy, nor has it been between Egypt and other African countries. So there's not going to be an excitement in that regard. I think the excitement will only concentrate on Ethiopia, which is the seat of the African Union.
Yeah, no, very interesting developments indeed. And of course, we'll continue to catch up with you over the coming days as further details around this relationship start to develop. Thank you very much for making the time to speak to us. Sthembiso Fakude there, just unpacking the new member states of Brics and now becoming the Brics 11 from January next year. Strategic pickings by the original 5 member states in terms of what they can offer when it comes to resources and other components that will contribute to economic growth. And just a reminder of the 2 African countries, Ethiopia, the fastest growing economy in Africa at the moment. So it is a country of 123 million people. It's got economic growth of 6.4%, something that was it's been able to maintain, and that is the latest growth figure. And then something that South Africa would definitely learn from them. An employment rate of 70%. 70% of its population is currently employed. And then if we move over to Egypt, which you've just heard Stembiso indicate there, does not necessarily identify itself as an African country. It just finds itself geographically attached to the African continent, but rather identifies as an Arab state. They've got an average economic growth rate of 6.6% as well, and then the unemployment rate in that country sits at 7.3%, and quite an exporter of significant commodities as well, including vegetable produce, aluminium, and of course other grains. We'll give you more facts around the new entrants as we continue with our rolling coverage on the final day of the 15th BRICS Summit at the Sandton Convention Centre, Baron.
Egypt, and the question mark also being, does Egypt consider itself to be an African country or not? But I think maybe in this context, when it comes to BRICS, it's not really necessary, something that should be up for debate. It is, like you just said, a very strategic position. Well, Egypt being in a very strategic geographical position could maybe be one of the factors that it was also considered to be part of the BRICS nations. And another interesting fact that you were discussing there in your interview, Rofhiwa, is, of course, where do we draw the line when it comes to those other countries as well, Saudi Arabia, Iran, the UAE, when it comes to human rights issues, moral issues, politics in general. I think it's that versus we know BRICS is more for trade, investment and economic growth. So where do we draw the line when it comes to that? Maybe I will unpack this further with international relations experts on the show. So thank you so much for your input there, Rofhiwa. We'll be crossing with you again maybe a little later.